It is my honor to introduce Sherry Saevil, and just a little introduction. She is a member of Mistawasis nêhiyawak and an alumni at the University of Saskatchewan. With over 30 years of experience working with the First Nations communities, Sherry has held a variety of roles, including historical researcher, policy analyst, and assistant director of lands and resources for Six Nations of the Grand River Territory. She currently serves as the Indigenous Education Advisor for the Hamilton Catholic District School Board. A passionate advocate for Indigenous education, Sherry believes deeply that reconciliation is achievable through education. Today, she is here to share her valuable insights on supporting residential school survivors, understanding their experiences, and advocating for their healing. Please join me in welcoming Sherry Saevil.
Well, good afternoon. It was challenging getting here from Milton. I had lots of traffic that I had to deal with and accidents on the 401. So I apologize for being a little late. My name is Sherry Saevil, and I'm Cree from Treaty 6 territory. Does anybody know where Treaty 6 is, you lawyers? Saskatchewan. And it extends into Alberta, that's right. And I want to just say thank you for having me, first off. And I am the Indigenous Education Advisor for Halton Catholic District School Board. There is Indigenous leads in all of our school boards in Ontario, 72 of them. And Indigenous leads are in every single one of them. The reason why I'm here, you can switch to the next slide, please. Oh, I guess I can try and click, see if it'll work. Is supporting residential school survivors and understanding and advocating for residential school survivors. And our previous speaker was talking about advocating and allies. And it is really vital and necessary to educate ourselves about residential school survivors. For over 150 years, residential schools were active in this country, and the government provided that along with the churches. And the reason why I know a little bit, just a little bit, about residential schools is my mother is a residential school survivor. I don't know if we can go next slide. First off, here's my little introduction, I guess, of what I wanted to go through. And more importantly, education, awareness, and calls to action. But here's what we're talking about here when we're talking about residential schools. For over, like I said, 150 years, residential schools were active in this country. And it was very aggressive assimilation. How can somebody turn around and be Indigenous that has to now act white? Take away all your land, your education, your ways of knowing, your ceremonies, your medicines, and now say that you are white. Duncan Campbell Scott was the one in Department of Indian Affairs that said he wants to get rid of the Indian problem and is not going to wait until there's not one Indian that hasn't been absorbed into the body politic. Sir Johnny MacDonald also said that. So those are our politicians that really wanted to get rid of us. Aggressive assimilation through the churches, through the government, through robbing Indigenous people of their land and their resources, putting us on reserves, needing a pass, and disbarring lawyers if you took up our claims. That's how much power the federal government has. How many schools were there? Well, here's a map from the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. Right across the country, but especially in the prairies. My mom and family was born in Saskatchewan in a community called Mistawasis. And Prince Albert is the closest city to Mistawasis. And so her family and brothers and sisters were kidnapped from their home. And kidnapped, I'm saying kidnapped because the RCMP went there with a loaded gun to my granny's house and grabbed the kids. Took them from Mistawasis, Prince Albert, and down to Saskatoon, and took a train from Saskatoon to Birtle, Manitoba, the lower part of the Manitoba province. And you can see how many residential schools there were in the prairie provinces. I don't need to read this, that there's 139 identified schools and a number of other schools that were not funded, that were funded by the provincial government. $150,000 kids attended residential school. 2020, I believe it was, when we first uncovered the 215 anomalies and unmarked grave sites, had really rocked Canadians. How could there be cemeteries in residential schools? Our families already knew that. They knew that there was cemeteries, not playgrounds, in an awful lot of our residential schools. And every single month, another anomaly was discovered. Another one and another one. And we know that right across the country, all those residential schools have cemeteries. And just this year, the government had capped the search for people's loved ones to $500,000, or it could take millions of dollars finding our loved ones with ground-penetrating radar. Oh, next slide, sorry. This is where my mom went to school, in Birtle, Manitoba. And when she went to the residential school from Prince Albert down to Saskatoon, got on a train all the way down to Birtle, Manitoba, and dropped off behind that building. When I was growing up, my mom would say the train is the loneliest sound she ever heard. And it's because the train had stopped right behind that residential school and dropped those kids off. Next slide, please. Well, what were they doing? Certainly weren't being educated. They were set to be somebody's domestic, not to amount to anything. Because again, those government policies were taken away from our people. Could not participate in the economy. We could not have access to our own lands and resources. We had education. We loved our kids. Our kids were the most important things in our lives. Our kids never left our side. And so they were always educated with aunties and uncles and grandmas and elders. When I went to the Truth and Reconciliation event in Saskatoon, there was all the churches there that had all of their archives, their pictures. And it was the first time that I had seen a picture of my mom when she was in residential school. And when I saw it, I knew exactly and where she was immediately. This is my mom. And when I saw her picture, I just started crying. And then I showed the picture to my auntie. And my auntie said, "That's your mom. But here's your auntie. And here's another auntie. All of them went to residential school. At the Truth and Reconciliation event, we were given Kleenex and a paper bag to put our soiled Kleenex after we've cried in the paper bag. And then they were going to have a sacred fire that night to honor our tears. And I've never felt so honored with my tears as looking after and how our people look after our own grief. Next slide, please. Well, a lot of things went wrong in there. Nobody's watching. We hear the stories of the survivors of sexual abuse, physical abuse. We know that there was kids that ran away. When they were caught, they were punished. Woodland Culture Center just in Brantford, the mush hole. There are my friends who are survivors there that tell me of being put in solitary confinement. These were kids, solitary confinement, given bread and water. And of course that damages people. When you have this kind of abuse on a regular basis and you can't go home, your parents have to come and get you, or else you stay there for years until you're released from prison. Parents were not allowed to go and visit their kids. And you needed permission from the Indian agent in order to have permission to leave the reserve. Next slide, please. We'll just keep on going to the pictures. Of course, there is a legacy of trauma. When you spend 150 years in a residential school, there is going to be some trauma that happens to your family and your family's family and their family. And at that time, there was no support for Indigenous women nor men in the 50s and 60s. And the only place you kind of thought that you might get some help is through maybe social services, to ask for somebody to talk to. And the minute my mom went into social services to go and ask what she can do, they came and took her kids away. All of my siblings, there's 10 of us in my family. The older 5 spent close to 8 years in a foster home. Not knowing we knew who our mom was, but we didn't grow up with our mother, with the stories, with our songs, with our legends. And to now have that experience at the Truth and Reconciliation event, where now these children are lining up and they have their residential school in front of them. But the only difference with these young kids is their parents are also in line with them, because those parents would have known what it was like to go to residential school. Next slide, please. Well, what can we do to support residential school survivors? Educate ourselves what happened. We have an awful lot of denialism in this country that it wasn't really that bad. At least you got an education. That's all lies, that there was sexual abuse. Church-going people have denied that and have denied it right in front of my face. Educate ourselves. Be aware of what's going on. Empathy. We don't know who is on the street that may have had that kind of trauma. We had our aunties and our sisters and our cousins, and that family support was really what helped us. Once we were reunited with our mother, I was 9 years old when I was reunited with our mother, but we had aunties, that's my auntie down there, and my cousins. And we had our family to hang around with and to support each other, even though both of my mom and my auntie in this picture were alcoholics. but we had our cousins. We had no idea why our parents were alcoholics. But I know, being a mom and a grandma now, that if my kids were taken away from me and my grandchild, there'd be darn hell that I would be hitting the bottle or taking pills to forget about where my kids are. So education, understanding where that has happened, 150 years in this country, and the Canadian government participated. They kept our parents, Canadians, ignorant. They devised a social constructivist theory of all the negative and stereotypes about us, but yet we're not like that. We're strong, resilient individuals that can climb mountains and overcome an awful lot of trauma. Next slide, please. These are my two aunties. Remember that little girl that I showed you there? She was maybe 6 or 7. That's my auntie on the right-hand side in the purple. She ended up becoming a nurse and did her master's degree in health. Next slide, please. Of course, I'll always take the opportunity to get a picture of some handsome men. That's myself before the COVID hair. And the late Senator Sinclair. And my young nephew, who is a lawyer in Saskatchewan. Mom had him when she was only 17. But because she had sisters and support, she kept him. And this young guy is a lawyer now. Next slide, please. The role of education and awareness. That auntie that I showed you on the left-hand side, her daughter just received her doctorate degree. The other auntie on the other side, she's got a daughter in there too. And her daughter has a daughter in this very picture. And they've all have their doctorate degree. And so when we're left alone, been able to participate in one generation, we were able to see an awful lot of things. Trust me, in my life, I've seen a lot, but this is greatness. This is achievement. This is resilience. This is understanding trauma. This is education and awareness, just in this one picture. I'm so proud of my cousins and my second cousin, to see them in their doctorate degrees and their smiling brown faces. It makes me very, very proud. Next slide, please. And of course, understanding cultural competency. We have an awful lot of Indigenous doctors. Anishinaabe, she's my friend, Dr. Pamela Toulouse. And to engage in what we know is Indigenous education, and a lot of school boards are doing that now. 34,000 in Halton Catholic that will know about Indigenous education, will know about an artist, will know about literature. In our school, it was students who were the advocates that the speakers talked about early, and the people that stand beside shoulder to shoulder. It was the students that said we need to have Indigenous education. And so we've made grade 11 English mandatory in Indigenous literature. And we're not the first board. There's an awful lot of boards doing that as well. But that also is a systems change within an education system to also have that. I think your speakers spoke about lots of people educating themselves, not to give up, to have people always allies. And this is what happens when we educate our young. Non-Indigenous youth that have said we need to have Indigenous literature in our schools. Next slide, please. And of course, calls to action. I think you guys have seen these little books. I brought 10 anyhow. And in here, it's the 94 calls to action. I believe law has 17 calls to look at different places and spaces within law, from police to colleges to learning about Indigenous ways of knowing and Indigenous law in your practice. We have Gladue reports, and some of you might know about Gladue reports. And that is an Indigenous way of knowing, to understand that person's experience and not to be maybe so harsh. When we're speaking about the prison system earlier, it's an awful lot of Indigenous people and Black people who make up that population in any prison. And to know that people right across the country, we have a premier, Wab Canoe, who's dedicated millions of dollars to go and find the loved ones that were murdered and buried at the landfill. But yet we still have on a daily basis police killing our youth, operating on our people, taking off the wrong limb. It is these things in Canada that still continually to happen. And so as lawyers and people who are interested in law, even just general Canadians, there's an awful lot that we can do when we're looking at reconciliation. We have to know the truth, and that's what Justice Sinclair had said. We have to know the truth first before we can even understand reconciliation. You have your United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and I brought 10 copies here too, to look at these as well and try and implement them as best we can within our own Canadian justice system. There was laws here beforehand, before colonists came here. And there's laws of fairness, of equity, knowing that if somebody committed a crime or did something to somebody in the community, there was something wrong with the community and not the individual how it is now. So we can learn an awful lot of the justice, the law, the trauma, but more importantly, our future in reconciliation. What does that look like? Next slide, please. And this is my mom. Why do I do this work? We always do it for something, right? That's my mom on the left-hand side when she was younger. Maybe she was probably about 22 or 23 years old. Pretty fancy. You know, she's got a pretty cool hair. And this is this is another picture later on, just before she passed away. And look at those serious dimples of her, to always try and get her to smile because we just loved her dimples. And so this is why I do the work within not only Halton Catholic, but come and speak whenever I can and talk to people about the importance. But not only that, we too are human. We just never got to know you, and you never got to know us. And that's unfortunate, and now we're trying to get to know each other. So Chi Miigwech, thank you for having me, and I wish you the wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you so much. My firm has been dedicated to helping the Indigenous population since 1997, I think was my first Indigenous client, and we represented the Walpole First Nations in the residential school survivor, and it was a wonderful experience. And last year we went literally coast to coast dealing with 60 Scoop survivors. So thank you very much for your insights. I can attest to the amazing ability that our Indigenous population has. We have so much to learn from them. We have done them wrong and continue to do them wrong. But right now, it's about hope. And I think that this conference is about hope. This is our third year of doing it, and it brings different communities together. It brings different people together, and from that, we gain hope and we gain strength and power. And what we have now to offer you is a networking event where we can actually have some fun. So it is right next door, like literally just right there. Please join us, and we can blow off some steam, and have some water, have a drink if you wish. Just be human and support each other. So thank you everyone for coming out, especially the survivors. Thank you. Take care of yourselves tonight. It's been a long, difficult, hard day, but it's also been an amazing, hopeful day. So thank you all.